Welcome to Netilogue on CGTN. I'm Zhou Yue here in Beijing. For many of us, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed our relationship with food, including the way we eat and what we eat. Now the United Nations is warning that the world stands on the brink of a food crisis, worse than any in the last 50 years. So how worried should we be? What will be the post-pandemic food supply system be looking like? And how have our eating habits changed? To discuss these issues and more, I'm honored to be joined on today's webcast by Dan Buchner, the National Geographic Fellow, Cassie Freston, New York Times bestselling author, and Fan Chenggen, Chair Professor at China Agricultural University, Professor Kelly D. Brownell, Director of the World Food Policy Center at Duke University, and founder of Youku. Viewers at home can also join by leaving questions or messages in the comment section of our social media account. I'd also like to thank the Good Food Fund of the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation for their support of our program. Why don't we start by making the opening statement within 1 minute on the eating habits today and what actually influence the way we eat. Let me start with Dan. Dan?
Yes, so my work has largely been around the populations who live the longest around the world. And you find that they're eating mostly a plant-based diet over time, very simple whole foods. But the reason they've been able to eat the right foods for long enough is because they live in environments where the healthiest food is cheapest and most accessible. And what's happened now in most of the world is the most accessible foods, while they may be inexpensive, they're unhealthy. And my position is that's driving the chronic disease load, mortality rate of COVID, and it's cutting our lives short by as much as a decade in most industrialized countries around the world.
Okay, Kathy?
Hi. Well, food is dictated by tradition. We eat what the culture has shown us for years. We eat what our parents made for us. And a lot of that is meat, dairy, and eggs. We grow up thinking that means and abundance. And unfortunately, the global demand for meat is rising, and the current meat production system is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to things like the pandemic, COVID, what we've just been through, to locust swarms, to environmental climate change. It's a very fragile system, and so that has to change. We can tweak traditions so we still enjoy the same foods, but we have to make it more sustainable and more resilient.
And Mr. Fan, your opening statement?
Yes, I have been working on food policy issues for the last 35 years. I have been working on food price crisis. Now the COVID-19 may bring another crisis. This crisis will be much bigger than the previous ones. So the food supply has been disrupted. People have lost their jobs, their income, so they do not have
that I believe are most important are that the norms that guide our eating have changed in profound ways. People are eating more often during the day. They're eating late at night. They're eating in places like their automobiles where that didn't used to occur. People are eating much larger portions, and they're exposed to food a lot more than they used to be. That's one factor. Another is the systematic and sophisticated manipulation of food by the food industry in order to trigger the reward centers in our brain and also other parts of our body. And the human body is just not adapted to handle these foods that are manipulated in these ways. And then finally, the marketing by the food industry has a profound influence on the foods we like and choose to eat. And unfortunately, the food companies tend to market most aggressively, especially to children, the worst foods in their portfolio.
And Victor, what would you say to our eating habits now?
Well, as we grow up, I think family as well as cultural upbringing is certainly the foundation of how we decide to eat. But as we've grown, basically, when you're thinking about your diet, there are considerations which has major impact to both human health as well as global warming, as well as animal welfare. So this is an area that the whole world need to focus on.
So let us start with some talks on the modern diet. Professor Fan, how have the diets changed in China since 1990s? Because of course, since the opening up and reform as started in the 1970s, Chinese have been eating differently, dramatically differently over the decades.
Yes,
What is the biggest change, do you think?
I think we have experienced the so-called diet and nutrition transition. Just in a decade or two, we have experienced from undernutrition, not enough to eat, to overnutrition, overweight, and obesity. So this happened just in 2 decades. So today in China, per capita meat consumption is about 60 kilograms, 6 times higher than in 1978. So when I went to the college that year. So today we have increased our meat consumption, increased consumption of fat, salt, sugar, and beyond. But in the meantime, we do not eat enough vegetables, fruits, beans, and so on. However, we must make sure that in remote area in China, in rural areas, there are still people who do not have enough to eat, not just in terms of calorie. More importantly, it's the diet quality. So they need a more balanced diet, fruits, vegetables, beans, and some high quality dairy products, meat, and so on. So when the children are well nourished, so they will be able to grow smarter, more intelligent, and they will be more productive in the future. So here in China, you can see it's a two divided world. So in coastal China, in cities, we eat too much meat. On the other hand, in rural areas, in remote Western regions, the children still need to access to good quality.
But in general, do you think better nutrition and better food have been contributed to longer life expectancy here in China? Or they're also suffering the results of relying on food that is too salty, sweet, and oily?
Yeah, I think overall, the diet quality in China has improved, and we must acknowledge that. On the other hand, as the time continues to move on, we must pay attention to what we eat. That will cut down our life expectancy. I mean, in America, other speakers will tell you the life expectancy has come down. Part of the reason is because of bad diet.
And Kelly, you seems to agree that actually the food industry contributing to some of the health problems we see in the advanced economies.
Well, this is showing up in rates of childhood obesity, for example. There's a group in London, the World Obesity Federation, that released a report last year on projected rates of childhood obesity going into the future. And if you look at the nations with the greatest up until the year 2030, the top nations are small places like the Marshall Islands, but the first large country on the list is China. And so, for example, we think of a lot of childhood obesity in the United States, but in 2030, for children ages 5 to 9, the rates in the United States are expected to be 26% of children being overweight or obese. And in China, the numbers are expected to be 32%.
More than the United States?
More than the United States. And this federation also established the likelihood of meeting the goals that have been set for 2025 by the World Health Organization, which is a very modest goal, which is to have no increase in prevalence in childhood obesity. And they predict that the United States only has 17% chance of meeting that goal, they predict China has 0% chance of meeting that goal.
Why is that? Why is China has a 0% of meeting that goal?
Probably the combination of declining physical activity and deterioration in the diet. You get improvements in lifespan as undernutrition gets corrected, but unfortunately there are corporate interests that overcorrect the problem, and people are consuming too many calories, too much salt, fat, and sugar, and as a consequence you get these very high rates of obesity.
And Dan, do you think that will become a global trend, not only for developed nations, but for developing nations as well, as they get up the ladder of nutritional value?
Yes, I do. And you should point out, corporate interests aren't necessarily malevolent. I mean, for many years, there weren't enough calories to feed populations, even here in the United States, until about 1970. But as Kelly points out, we've overcorrected. We've been too good at creating cheap calories and then marketing them. And the areas in the world that I've studied for National Geographic, and Sardinia, Italy, Icaria, Greece, the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, all these traditionally the highest life expectancy, which meant they were eating mostly a whole plant food diet. And as that's been displaced by this standard American diet, ultra processed foods and over or close to 100 kilograms of meat a year, you see the rates of heart disease, cancer, diabetes shoot upward, and their life expectancy shooting downward. So yeah.
But realistically, can we expect people living elsewhere to have a lifestyle as those you mentioned in those probably more isolated places?
All this bad they overcome every other problem that presents with country information and so forth and transition, and the wisdom that these populations give us are completely. And if health becomes a priority for governments, the policies to improve the health of these populations are difficult. Kelly's
Dan
pointing out
get stuck there. Oh, okay. Dan, your voice got choppy there. Kathy, could you please speak up there? Because as Dan explained, information is important, but how can we get across those informations to the general public? Because they're easily influenced by the commercials, by the messaging from the food industry. And also, their food really tastes good.
It does taste good, and that's the secret ingredient, is making things taste good and having the food be culturally familiar so that we can continue our traditions. And Dan, I think, would say that the best ingredients for all of this food in the blue zones is taste, how to make whole food taste delicious.
Yeah.
So that's the most important thing. I think, the younger really getting it. I think the younger generation is saying, we see a crisis coming. We see global climate change happening, and we're the ones who are going to have to deal with it. And our parents and our grandparents weren't paying attention, and now it's up to us. And we see the younger generation, not necessarily me, but younger than me, sees that we need to change the way that we eat. How do we do that? And we look to technology now. It's incredible how plant-based burgers and sausages and cheese and milk taste so good, virtually indistinguishable from animal-based foods. And so that's something that this newer generation is saying, wait a second, we can enjoy our traditions. We can eat food that tastes delicious, that leaves us feeling full and satiated, and it's not going to go out and create climate change. It's not going to add to pandemics in the world. It's not going to have this incredible cruelty to animals. and it's going to be better for human health because animal meat is full of fat. It's got all kinds of salmonella and E. coli, all kinds of pathogens. It's creating heart disease and some kinds of cancers and type 2 diabetes. So I think that ideally, the way they eat in the blue zones is perfect. Things that are grown in the ground and on trees and very local. But we also have to enjoy our traditions. And that means burgers and sausages and cheeses and fun foods. And we can do that making those things from plants, from plant-based foods.
But Victor, you are entrepreneurs. Do you think the food industry have the incentive to make that paradigm shift, making more plant-based food, relying less on meat and those ingredients that may be harmful to human health?
Well, first of all, I think the public awareness needs to be improved and changed. And I think we have opportunity with what's happening with COVID-19, where I think especially the younger audience that Kathy pointed out are really more conscious about the importance of health, how to improve their immunity, and the correlation between pre-existing conditions as well as fatality rates. And so the awareness on the consumer side is very important. And at the end of the day, the businesses will look at demand patterns to really decide what they want to provide. But at the same time, it's very important to provide delicious options. The problem is the misperception sometimes that vegetarian options, especially here in China, think they may not taste very good or are for religious reasons. So I think there needs to be a complete public awareness campaign to change that thinking for people to realize a vegetarian or a plant-forward diet is one good for you, good for the environment, and good for the world.
Mr. Fan, vegetarianism, actually it has a long history, and as Victor just mentioned, is probably closely linked to religions such as Hinduism and Buddhism here in Asia. But do you think it is, again, becoming increasingly popular because of this has become a cultural fad?
Yeah, I have been involved in the production of 2 global reports. The first one is so-called Sustainable Diet, a Healthy Diet from Sustainable Food System, published by each Lancet Commission. Another report is from Food and Land Use Coalition, Growing Better report. The board reports argue for more plant-based diets. So we must eat more plant-based foods, cut down meat consumption for our health and for our environment. But we also wanted to emphasize for children in Africa, in South Asia, they needed to access to high quality animal proteins during their early ages. That will be very critical for their growth. So overall, yes, absolutely, we must cut down the meat consumption, but there's no one size fits all. So it will not be fair for the children in Africa, South Asia, who may lose opportunity for their growth, for their earning more income opportunities, being smarter and more intelligent.
That's a very good point, because a large number of people in the in the developing world were probably asking for more meat consumption. So how can we provide meat for them? Kelly, meat alternatives, it seems to be a new idea. It's catching up fast. According to a study by Barclays Banks, the global market could be worth $140 billion in the next 10 years. Do you think it will be the future for meat, alternative meat?
I think it's likely to be at least part of the picture, but I think it's too early to know the health consequences of consuming these products. And also, I think it's a little too early to know the true environmental consequences of producing them. So I'd say that the jury is still out on those. Now, an interesting...
It is assumed it is less stressful on the environment than the traditional meat industry.
Yes, but in part, it may depend in part on the way the traditional meat is produced. So there's a relatively, new in terms of public attention approach to agriculture known as regenerative agriculture. where you rotationally graze animals with no carbon inputs. The grasses that can grow from these conditions sequester carbon. And there's some research suggesting that this approach to raising animals for protein can actually have a net benefit. Now, it's too early to know whether that is true, but there's some evidence that suggests it might be. So it's possible that the environmental impact of raising animals can be minimized, and that might change the equation between the artificially produced meat and the meat produced from animals.
But why some food companies already ambitiously and aggressively trying out that option already?
Well, if it turns out to be that these products are better for health, human health, and they're better for the environment, then hooray! I think we all have something to feel good about. But I just think they haven't been in place long enough to know what the long-term health consequences will be. And there have only been a few reports that I've seen on the environmental consequences. So I'd say they're promising, and in all likelihood, they'll continue to grow in market share. But it's possible that if the environmental impact of raising farm animals can be reduced, then there may not be such an environmental difference as we might expect.
Can I just interject here something? That regenerative agriculture, I agree, is something really important to look at. The problem is the global demand for meat is so huge that's why we have factory farms. That's why we have concentrated animal feeding operations, is because the demand is so high. So if we were to move to a system like that, we couldn't possibly, if we took down every building in the entire world and returned everything to nature, to grazing, we still would not have enough land to graze animals in that way. That's the thing. We have to reduce the meat that we eat, the amount of meat that we eat. So that's the ideal thing. And plus the burgers and the sausages, those are fun foods. It's more of the blue zones eating whole grains and beans and vegetables and things like that. And every once in a while we have a fun burger or a sausage or something like that. But the idea is that we really need to reduce our meat consumption, because even in the best practices where we're using the soil, we're regenerating, we're rotating, and we're raising animals humanely, even in the best conditions, we cannot supply a fraction of the global meat demand.
So what will be the regulators do to turn things into a direction that is both cost-effective and also healthy for people and environment?
Can I say here, I have been working on policy issues. I think we failed in policy. One is we do not invest enough in innovations to cut down the carbon emission of food production. The secondly, yes, consumer behaviors. Consumer wanted to consume something is tasty, but don't forget this taste. Said we can actually develop children's taste while they are still very young. The school feeding programs from primary school, middle school, high school, even to universities, you can actually influence people's preference. Then taxing. If let's say the beef production has emitted 20 times more carbons than let's say crop-based proteins use 20 times more water, this sort of environmental cost has not been reflected in pricing. And then similarly on health, if you eat too much meat, then you will have diabetes or heart attack or even certain cancers. It's not just the cost to you, to your family. It is the cost to the society. How can we reflect that cost in pricing that food is very critical. So if we can tax unsustainable, unhealthy foods, particularly meat, and use that money for innovations to cut down emissions, to protect our land, to protect our biodiversity, is the way to go.
I agree with the professor, but I want to add one thing here. Is the public awareness of those issues are still very weak, especially here in China. What people don't realize is if you look at the top leading causes of death in China, now actually in the last decade, it's become exactly the same as the US. If you look at cardiovascular diseases, cancer, as well as chronic respiratory disease, that's driving 77% of the deaths in China. And I would bet that the public awareness of that is very, very low. And out of those factors, actually, if you look at the key determinants of these major diseases, chronic diseases, diet and nutrition is actually 53%, and smoking being the second is 16%. Those two factors in terms of diet and nutrition, as well as smoking, drives all the leading causes of death in both China as well as the US. But the public awareness of this and the drivers behind this is actually not being promoted enough. Whereas, and on the other hand, all the existing companies are promoting fast foods, industrial farmed products. And so you don't have a counterbalance within the society of people understanding the costs and benefits of this, which drives policy and which drives businesses.
Who is to provide the counterbalance? The government doesn't want to be too much in your face, because many people say, I have the freedom to choose whatever food I want. Can the government do the job of providing the public messaging? Dan?
I think the government plays a role. I think Kathy brings up a good point that you have to create healthy, delicious plant-based alternatives. But my work is largely with cities. Cities can often pass policies very quickly and very effectively. For example, we see in our cities that pass a ban on junk food advertising. We see the obesity rate in those cities drop in just a couple years. You can limit the number of fast food restaurants in a square kilometer. And I don't think we can rely on the government to the source of effective information dissemination. But I do think the government can do, local government especially, there's 30 or 40 evidence-based ways you can shape your city so that whole plant foods are cheaper and more accessible. And we've seen this, for example, in Fort Worth, Texas, a city that's obsessed with beef. When they put their mind to it and we focused for 4 years on optimizing policies, we saw the obesity rate drop by 6%, and it didn't drop in the rest of Texas. So you have to realize it can be done. It just requires a systematic approach. And I believe that the best return on the on resources is local policies.
Yeah, I think the government plays a critical role. But I agree with Victor that it is a public citizen that have to drive the whole process, because the government will respond to their citizens. So if the citizens wanted to have better, healthy, more sustainable foods, then they will push the political process, whether it's the Congress, Parliament, or the administration, to change the policy, to change the investment priorities, to change the funding of the universities to do more innovative research to achieve both sustainable, healthy, and nutritious diets.
You know, and there's an interesting intersection between what the public does and what government does. And the public gives government permission to protect our health in many ways. Automobile safety standards, for example, drinking water standards, clean air standards, and the like. And more and more you're seeing the government permission to have a healthier food supply. We already do it around food safety standards. But think, for example, of sugared beverage taxes. You know, it wasn't many years ago when we were working on this when people thought those taxes were a crazy idea. And now they exist in 50 countries around the world and a number of cities within the US. And the results are showing significant reductions in sugar beverage consumption. And then if the revenues got used for some important nutrition aim, like lowering the cost of healthy foods like fruits and vegetables, then you'd have a double bonus from them. So I think more and more people are giving government permission to protect us through the food supply, and changing prices is just one such way.
But do we expect some blowbacks from food in the industry? Because we saw that in cigarette industry decades ago. They wouldn't be very comfortable having that kind of change.
Yeah, the food industry has behaved very much like the tobacco industry behaved decades ago. using the same playbook, using the same public relations firms, and basically using the same arguments, that it's not our product that's causing harm, it's overuse of the product. And therefore, the responsibility should be shifted from the corporations to the individuals. But more and more people aren't accepting that argument. And that's why things like getting rid of sugared beverages in schools, getting rid of junk foods in schools, taxing these things is becoming more common. So the industry is pushing back with tremendous amounts of money and public relations, but they're not winning the battles for the most part.
And at the same time, they are investing in plant-based products. And so they see an opportunity for huge growth. And you see some of the biggest meat and processed food companies like Tyson and Cargill getting into the alt protein business because they see that as the future. They're losing money with COVID when slaughterhouse workers are dying in untold numbers and they're putting animals, they're killing them because they can't use them. It's just an unsustainable food system. So they're seeing the future, and these big food companies are getting in on it. They see opportunity. And so that's when things start to change, is when these big corporations embrace the future and they move toward it. And they're making things that are more price accessible, and it's going to be out there in a bigger way.
Are you guys optimistic or pessimistic? Paradigm shift anytime soon in the world? More plant-based food, more sustainable and reliable food source?
I'm hugely optimistic. I think it's happening so much faster than we could have expected. You've got this intersection of food companies starting to invest and awareness of the younger generation of what's happening in our environment and human health. And those two things have intersected and it's exploding. So I'm very optimistic.
But in fact, I think COVID-19, go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, I think me too. To do more. One is obviously policy. I have already mentioned. Policy is very critical. Until you change the policy, you're not going to move very far. That's number one. Number two, innovations. I do think there are enough innovations that have not been taken into consideration. Innovations, let's say, in conserving water, conserving land, conserving biodiversity, and the carbon reduction. And lots of technologies over there. We have not done a good job in using this technology or scale them up. Then thirdly, behavior change. Can we use the modern technologies to change the behavior? I know the anti-smoking movement, wearing seatbelt movement is a social movement. I think we should do the same thing on our diets. The overweight, disseminated this message to everybody in the world that overweight, obesity is a killer. Just like not wearing seatbelt, will kill the whole family. So I think we can do more on that front.
I agree with the professor. I think the other point is this time window is very, very critical because COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease, which means it was actually transmitted from animal food to humans. And because of the correlation between food and really the fatality rate, is a really important opportunity to raise public awareness in China as well as globally between the ties of food as well as health as well as environment. And so this is an area where I agree to be proactive, but we also need to leverage the opportunity now.
What about you, Dan?
Well, I think people are generally aware when they're eating junk food. I think people like to eat the food they like to eat, and that's most convenient. One.
How do you change people's choices?
I'll give you a real world example. So we were hired by the whole island of Hawaii to try to change their eating habits. And instead of trying to convince them to take on new innovation, we looked at the pre-1940s diet of Hawaii that we found was mostly tubers, complex carbohydrates, and we marketed them the idea of eating their traditional foods. And if you look at the traditional diet of China, you're going to find complex carbohydrates, you're going to find lots of greens, you're going to find beans, you're going to find that meat is a celebratory food that wasn't eaten very much except for maybe the Lunar New Year. And I think there's a really rich opportunity to these chefs that spend so much time making pork belly taste delicious or bone marrow. If they take the traditional foods of China and make them taste delicious, it's not a big sell. And by the way, the reason people ate a certain way for thousands of years is because it worked for their local environment. It was sustainable, and they probably were calorically deficient, but for the most part, they were getting the nutrition they need. So instead of just looking forward for some new technology to create some new meat analog, I would argue looking back at traditional Chinese cuisine, stuff that peasants were eating, and having chefs make that taste good again, and having local policies favoring that kind of food over the highly processed foods.
Is that applicable, Professor Fan? That we go back to our traditional way of cuisine, but also make it marketable and accessible?
Sure. Well, I grew up in a very poor village in southern China. So I was hungry, I was malnourished. I experienced all kinds of forms of malnutrition, undernutrition. I don't think we should go back to our traditional poor peasants' diet.
No.
So
I just mean the food.
Right.
Not the lack of it.
Well, let me come back to the opportunity we are really facing, the COVID-19. So here in China, I came back to China about 6 months ago, being in US for 35 years. And COVID-19 really gave us, well, COVID-19 obviously is a crisis, is a challenge. It gives us a unique opportunity to change people's diet. We have done a survey, consumer survey, that consumers are willing to change their diets. They wanted to reduce the consumption or even ban the consumption of wildlife. There's absolutely no question about it. The second, they wanted to have a more healthy and nutritious diets because they know that if they have non-communicable diseases, they will be very vulnerable to COVID-19 diseases. So that message is clear. How can we use this momentum, this as an opportunity to make sure that our diets will continue to be healthy and sustainable, even COVID-19 is gone?
Okay, I'd like to talk about food safety a little bit because obviously we all want better food, healthier food. But what about those people who are facing the threat of no food? Since the end of 2019, locust swarms, COVID-19, floods, especially in East Africa, have affected the local food supplies and caused price fluctuations. Some countries are restricting exports because of their worry about chaos and probably disruption of supply. So what impact will these factors have on global food supply? And what should we do about it? Why don't we start with Kelly?
Well, I believe that the COVID crisis in particular has trained much more world attention on vulnerabilities of the food supply. And this is for the good because there's more attention to the policy changes that Dr. Fan spoke about in order to create a more resilient food supply that can survive shocks like COVID or other things. So I see a bright future for that. I think the fact that more people are paying attention to where their own food comes from and they're paying more attention to these international food crises means that there will be more attention to the policy changes that need to be made in order to protect the food system.
But is the world now relying too much on export, import, the trade of food across borders? And that is a vulnerability.
Oh, it sure is. The trade wars that have occurred between the U.S. and China have involved food in a number of cases, and that have created a lot of trouble within our own country, and I imagine in China as well. And so these import and export issues need to be worked out. International bodies need to come together. There needs to be tighter global governance over these things, and a more thoughtful way of addressing import and export issues in order to address the food insecurity that's so rampant now.
Yeah, but the problem is the world governance is what is lacking. That's why we are so worried about whether we can still import food from elsewhere.
Yeah, my own belief is that this needs to be dealt with at the highest levels of government. And if the heads of state could come together and see that that the food system is so interlocking and that all countries could benefit from a sensible group of policies, then maybe you could create some global governance where it doesn't exist now.
Right. Well, this is
Professor Fan.
Yeah, as economists, we feel very proud. You know, the COVID-19 really began to spread to the world sometimes in February, March, and April. And immediately the economists begin to form a group to discuss the looming crisis. So we knew that the trade ban or export bans could be a real issue. So we begin to write articles in different media, and we begin to contact the UN organizations, and we begin to write blogs and so on. So the key milestone is the G20 ministers of agriculture. They together issued a statement and to, let's say, to ban, not just to ban, to discourage the countries not to use export ban as a way to secure their own food supply. So that really helped. So just before that, that's in May. So before that, many countries like Vietnam, even Russia, Ukraine, tried to use export bans, the food export bans. They had a plan. Some countries already executed some bans, but because of the global pressure, these countries begin to relax or begin to, let's say, abolish the export bans. This is something really shows we can work together to some of the global challenges, global the risks we are all facing. So now going forward, Africa, South Asia, we're facing crisis if we don't work together. Don't forget, Africa every year is importing $40 billion of food. If the whole supply chain is disrupted, you know, whether it's domestic or international, where do they get $40 billion of food? If they don't get that, then lots of people will go hungry. As many said, in addition to COVID-19, they are already struggling with droughts, floods, locusts, so in a refugee crisis. So attention must be paid there.
Professor,
Asia,
do you think the disruptions are just temporary, or they could probably stay? Because people worry this kind of economic nationalism will become a trend as people are worried about their own economic security and food security.
Yeah, well, it is a wake-up call for everybody. You know, for Africa, for South Asian countries, they will think how they can secure their food supply during crisis. You know, whether it's a trade war, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's climate change. I think it is a wake-up call. It's not necessarily bad. I think they must rethink of a global food system we must have to make sure that, yes, trade remains open, because trade will make sure that we can consume, you know, fruits or foods from every part of the world, not just in my neighboring, let's say, farms. So that's a good part of the trade. But on the other hand, we must make sure that if some sort of shocks come, we have a way to deal with it. Trade should remain open, supply chains should continue to work, and poor people must have social protection, you know, whether it's income, whether it's a cash transfer, whether it's a food assistance programs, particularly school feeding programs. They must continue to work, to run.
And Dan, what do you think changes need to happen to ensure that the global food supply is stable, more pandemic-proof, or is it possible?
Yes, well, there's two things. The first one, I mean, we've been talking about this a lot, but it takes 11 kilos of grain to make 1 kilo of beef. So shifting again away from animal foods, which are more likely to spawn disease, and more to grains. So the beauty of tubers beans and grains is you can store them for a year or more in many cases. They're shelf stable. And, you know, there's in this country, and it drives me crazy, there's this infatuation with fresh fruits and vegetables. Yes, it's a good idea, but you get 90% the way there if you're eating sweet potatoes, beans, and grains, and focusing on that. The second, every blue zone in the world, every population where people lives a long time, there's a very strong tradition of growing your own garden. A very easy thing for governments to promote is that everybody go out back, no matter how small your yard is, or a public garden, and grow a garden. That gives you some food security. Especially if you have our ancestors have been doing throughout time. And I can't really speak to locusts or, you know, a transportation system, but I can tell you growing a garden will help.
Growing a garden, Victor, can China afford to go back to growing a garden by your own?
Well, you're actually starting to see people have gardens in rooftops now. That is becoming a trend that's going on.
Yeah, that happened in
cities.
Wuhan when it was in lockdown. Many people
That's right.
grew vegetables on their rooftop.
Because they can't get outside. But the other thing I want to highlight is that the importance of local as well as seasonal foods, which is actually a traditional Chinese way of eating as well, 节气 and so forth, right? And so while it's important to make sure these exports continue, I think it's very important for the government as well as the state media to promote local as well as regional foods. And in countries like Japan, for example, which is one of the blue zones, basically this is actually very prevalent, where each of the prefecture actually promote their own regional vegetables and talk about what kind of vegetables grow in what kinds of areas, as well as the benefits and advantages of that. And I really think that that's something China should promote as well.
Another
even
thing
in
that
poor
China,
countries, let me just add one point here. Even in poor countries like Bangladesh, they also use this so-called a homestead garden to produce fruits, vegetables for the whole family, instead of just growing rice or wheat or maize. So that really helped to improve the nutrition status of the children. So it's not just to overcome overnutrition, even undernutrition. So growing some foods in your garden can help tremendously.
I mean, globally, there's 800 million or so people that are undernourished, 2 billion people that are overnourished. So one is the balancing in terms of the food patterns globally, and how to encourage local and regional seasonal foods to be consumed and more plant-based, like Dan was.
But does it make economic sense if I grow my own tomato and potato on the rooftop? It's more expensive than I go to a supermarket and buy those things from the shelves.
Well, clearly it should be a supplement, not the only venue where you're getting your food.
Here's the thing, producing meat is wildly inefficient. I mean, you feed the animals corn, wheat, soy, and it makes those grains too expensive for developing countries to afford. So the fact that we're taking up all this corn, wheat, and soy and we're feeding it to livestock really makes no sense. There'd be plenty of food to feed the world if we fed those grains directly to humans rather than people. And the uniformity of these grains that go to animals, to livestock, that creates fragility in the system, whether it's because of trade issues or because of a diseased crop or whatever. Whereas if you take plant-based meat, the technology now is you can use a wide variety of different kinds of grains, and then you have a more widely distributed supply chain. The networks are more diverse and all over the place, so it's not so uniform. We're giving ourselves more room. And also, I just want to say that there's something very interesting happening with cellular agriculture. And that's kind of the future too, is growing real animal meat, real animal flesh from cells without the animals. So we're getting much more efficient with creating real animal meat so that we don't have to feed all these grains that could go to developing countries to animals that don't actually produce those calories of protein.
The technologies is already here, Professor Fan.
Yes.
Cellular.
Well, I think the this so-called
technology.
pan-based proteins or meat are much more matured, and the prices are much lower. But for so-called lab meat, it's still very far way to go. I don't think we will be able to afford.
How far away
meat.
is it?
We're getting
10
there.
years, 10 years, 20 years?
Maybe even
Because
20
if we
years.
can grow
Still very-
meat in factories, it will be much easier to grow livestock.
Right. But there are
Yeah.
some other technologies, for example, so-called single-cell protein. So you don't need to produce very fancy, very complex meat. Let's say the single-cell protein can be used as feed, can be used as ingredients of processing nutritious, healthy foods. So that one is a new tech. So that's why I try to emphasize new technology innovations where we can really bring some of the so-called game-changing, innovations to our society.
Are enough money being spent, enough talents gathered in that area to make that happen?
Well, I don't know whether you have seen a report called Horizon 2030. So that report shows you lots of good, promising technologies. It shows that in US, you don't need to have the big animal or livestock industry. Maybe all this sort of livestock farming system will be gone, or maybe will shrink by 50%, maybe even more. That's because of this sort of a new game-changing technologies. So we must keep our mind open. I mean, some of the great investors, including Bill Gates, are investing in these new technologies.
One thing that's interesting as I listened to all this discussion.
Another topic I want to talk a little bit about is wet market. Yeah, Kelly, go on.
Well, I was saying as I'm listening to this discussion, it's interesting how we're speaking about increasing awareness of the food system. So how does climate change affect agriculture? And then how does agriculture in turn affect climate change? How can we reduce the environmental impact of food, like creating and eating less meat, by having local foods, by people growing their own gardens? It's all starting to fit together into a picture. And you asked earlier whether we were optimistic. I'm very optimistic because of these kind of discussions, but not only among people who are experts in thinking about this, but just people in general are becoming more aware of this. And as Kathy said earlier, young people in particular are, and I see this when I teach classes, that young people are getting increasingly and amazingly sophisticated about understanding the food supply. And they want to understand the story of their food. They want to know where it comes from and who grew it, and what its environmental impact was, and what the labor implications were of who got the food on the table for them. And these are all very good signs. And as people start to see food as a system, and they understand that what they eat has impacts on the environment has impacts on what they eat, then I think policies will change because there will be more public support for them. People will begin to change their own behaviors. So I see a lot of reasons to be optimistic.
Yeah. And I also think consuming food is a cultural thing, because wet markets, a lot of controversy on this. China's fresh meat, fish, and sometimes wildlife. So there have been recently a lot of talks about the connection between wet market and COVID-19. Professor Fan, what is your opinion about wet market? Of course, it's a very unique cultural heritage here in China, but is it something that's gonna stay?
Yeah, well, even globally, it's not just in China. The wet markets, agricultural markets played a huge role in feeding low-income populations. So there's no doubt they will stay. But that does not mean we don't do anything about it. I think better regulation, it's better investment, and a better education, about the consumers and the producers, to make sure that the wet market will continue to play a very important, let's say, the cross point between consumers and the producers. And I think better regulations will be critical, but equally important is implementation. For example, even here in China, the wet market, we already had a nuts regulations and nuts laws, but we have not done a good job in implementing them. I think globally, Africa, South Asia, the wet market plays even a bigger role than here in China. So it's not just the problem here.
Because people can enjoy food that are locally produced.
Yes, will continue to come. But obviously now, because e-commerce, the internet, really facilitated point-to-point delivery. Let's say from producing communities to consuming urban communities. That sort of a supply chains has been developed or promoted during the COVID-19. That may change to some extent, change the food supply chain to some extent. But I think in the future, we will still continue to see urban supermarkets, wet markets, the e-delivery, e-platforms, so multiple channels to deliver foods from production origins to final consumption destinations.
Yeah, and do Americans also appreciate the fact that, well, the Chinese enjoy very much fresh and seasonal food. That's why they like the wet markets a lot. Do Americans also appreciate that?
We go to Whole Foods. I don't think wet markets are a big part of the current day culture.
Farmers market.
There are seasonal farmers market, but what you don't have are these big wildlife markets, and it's not our custom for the most part to go to a wet market to buy meat, and I think when you look at the cost of all probability that diseases like COVID have jumped to the human species via an animal species, that we ought to be taking a hard look at the total cost of having markets that are selling, wild animals and quite honestly meat. I mean, it's costing the world many trillions of dollars to deal with these pandemics, and I think that has to be considered when we think about policy.
It's going to boil down to money. It's costing us, in the United States, we have our factory farms, and it's in many ways an embarrassment to us to see how the animals are treated and to see E. coli breakouts and salmonella and campylobacter. It's a lot to consider, and all the different cultures around the world have issues around raising animals for food, and it's getting to the point where it doesn't seem to be sustainable when it shuts down large swaths of the population and business. We have to take a good hard look at how we are producing protein and reconsider it, because the sustainability is just not there, whether it's wet markets or American factory farms. The old way of doing things, it needs to be tweaked and updated, and that's across the globe. It's an issue across the globe.
Another major change has already happened is how the food is processed. Because of COVID-19, many people choose to cook at home. Does it make any changes to our diet and nutritional intake?
Well, I think it's not just more cooking at home, but also e-delivery. So you order food from the restaurant, right?
Okay.
I think, again, this is a risk and also great opportunity to influence how the food is cooked, right? In this sort of a restaurant that will be delivered to each household. I think right now, you don't see how food is cooked, and they just deliver to your doorstep. And not sugar, and not so fat, oil. You really don't know. So can we do better there? Can we empower the consumers? Give them, that's a great, when we receive the food.
Do consumers have choices? Because if they know what is in their food, they can make a better informed choice.
Well, I think, again, there are technologies you can actually track what you have in your food. Sorry to say that. I mean, I'm a university professor. I always emphasize the innovation, to really track what you have in your food, whether it's safe, whether it's nutritious, whether it has too much sugar, too much fat, absolutely. But here I wanted to emphasize another point. You mentioned about the wet market. I think the zoonotic diseases can come from the whole production chain, smallholder farms, processing, yes, and the whole chain. So I think 70% of the human communicable diseases came from food and agriculture, chicken, duck, pigs, and so on. So we must pay attention.
I've got some questions from the internet. Some users are watching our discussions. This is from Weibo. Alice in Wonderland said, will the post-COVID era be more about how to eat healthy than how to eat delicious? Will that affect people's happy index around the world? I'm simply not happy eating healthy food. What do you say to that?
I say they're eating the wrong healthy food. I mean, it's so easy.
But
healthy
there
food.
isn't many options. They're saying I can choose delicious food wherever I want, but I can't choose delicious healthy food because I don't know.
It's a little jump. I don't know if you've ever gone from, say, drinking whole milk to skim milk or lower fat milk. At first, when you taste it, it's like, I don't really like it. It's not as rich. But when you decide, okay, you know what? I know this is better for the planet. I'm just going to push myself a little bit. I'm going to lean into it. It's not perfect right away. It's not exactly the same right away, but there's so much upside to tweaking your taste buds, and it takes like 10 days.
It takes effort then. People hate taking efforts.
Yeah. I just wanted to use my family's example. So we used to eat, the white rice, the white bread, and so on. But because of our knowledge about nutrition and health, about 15 years ago, we began to reduce the meat consumption. We begin to consume brown rice, the whole wheat bread, and so on. Actually, today, we really like the food we eat. If you ask me to come back to eat white rice, it does not taste anything. If you ask me to eat white bread, I don't want to have it. So it takes maybe a month.
Professor, you're asking everybody to spend some years to cultivate that habit, which is not easy to get.
But there needs to be motivation, right?
With a university, that's a university. This China Agricultural University has the best student cafeteria among all the universities here in Beijing. You know why? Because they work with some of the nutritionists to cook nutritious, healthy, and tasty foods. So they ranked #1. So next time when you have a chance to come to China Agricultural University, try the student cafeteria.
So you have to send out the message. It's not only smart, it's also intelligent to try something other than the traditional food. Kelly, what do you want to say?
Well, I think government can also help this process along in important ways. It's not an easy thing to do on a broad scale because the unhealthy food has a powerful biological reinforcing effect on people. I mean, sugar in particular.
We are genetically wired to like those kind of food.
Yeah, we are. And sugar in particular triggers addictive properties in the brain. You get withdrawal, you probably get tolerance, you get cravings and things. So it's not easy to do the retraining, although it can be done. So some people can just do it on their own, and we've heard some good examples of that. But the question is, can government help this process along? And I think government can. For example, by changing the relative price of healthy and unhealthy foods. That will encourage people to consume more of the healthy foods. They can get accustomed to them, and their preferences can change. Changing the foods available in schools can make a big difference in the same way. So I think if government gets involved in a way that helps push some of these things along, we can accelerate the process.
Not only government, I have a question exactly to you, Doctor. So Kelly, your research about soda tax, this is from Fiona He on Twitter. And she said, it's pretty fascinating on the soda tax. Added sugar is hard to ignore, but for now in people's diet, what added sugar you found is the hardest to eliminate? What kind of sugar that is the stubborn? that is the most stubborn?
Well, it's a hard question to answer. I mean, there are some things like sugared beverages where pretty much the only thing in them is sugar and water. And so it's pretty easy to reduce sugar by doing something with those. Probably the hardest parts are the amount of added sugar in normal foods where people don't realize there's sugar. Things like soups and ketchup and condiments and, you know, lots of things have added sugar. And people ordinarily aren't thinking about those products as having sugar. So reducing those products is going to be more difficult, but I think really important to do. And it's hard to count on any of the companies individually to make these changes because they don't want to lose market share by having their foods be less palatable than those of their competitors. But if government could mandate slowly titrating down the amount of sugar, the amount of salt, the amount of fat in foods, then you could get people changing their preferences over time, like the change from whole milk to skim milk would be an example of that, or reducing the salt in soups. I think that's an important role government can play to help retrain people's taste preferences.
Talking about retraining taste, do you think technologically it is possible to have some healthy ingredients that can trigger that kind of a sugar high as sugar does?
I don't know whether that's possible or not. I mean, you know, you might be able to find artificial chemical type things that would do that and then stick those things in healthy foods, but I'm not sure if people would approve of that kind of manipulation.
As Kathy pointed out, it's easy to wean yourself off of sugar. I think one of the great silver linings to this whole COVID menace is that we can't go out to eat as much, so we can relearn the art of cooking. If you saw the amount of salt in a soup or the amount of sugar in a yogurt, you probably wouldn't eat it. And at least in the United States here, if you're going out to eat, you're consuming about 200 calories more than you would if you just stayed at home. So, and I think an easy answer during COVID, a great opportunity is find one of your grandmother's cookbooks and cook what your family.
If I can. If I can.
Well, any plant-based cookbook, a whole food plant-based cookbook, and cook with your family. And I know it sounds hopelessly optimistic and so kind of simple, but it works. And we see it over and over working in our blue zone cities.
There is a Twitter-based question. UC Lee asked this question is to you, Kathy. You have been promoting a vegan lifestyle for many years. So you have, right, Kathy?
Yep.
For those who are in malnutrition in the developing countries, does it make sense to choose vegetables over meat and egg?
Yeah, the good thing about plant-based foods is that it is inexpensive and it is very filling. It's got lots of fiber in it. It's nutrient dense. Beans are very, very inexpensive. Whole grains are very, very inexpensive. Like Dan said, sweet potatoes, things that are very simple. You don't need fresh kale and chard or things like that. But absolutely, the satisfaction of having a full belly that's got all the fiber and the nutrient dense food that comes with plant-based food, absolutely.
But also a lot of protein in there in beans.
Oh yeah, a lot of protein. I mean, most people they think they're going to eat eggs because it's full of protein, right? Well, 6 grams of protein, 3 in the yolk, 3 in the white. Well, 1 cup of lentils, which is a tiny little bit, 1 cup of lentils is 18 grams of protein. So lentils are super inexpensive, tons of protein, lots of minerals and fiber. So you're really going to feel more satiated and it's more sustainable.
I have another question on Weibo, cheese Yan Yan. Well, she obviously is a cheese fan. I'm really curious about the guest cuisine secrets. Can you share some of your favorite recipes? Wow. Can you? Maybe Kathy, you have one that you want to share?
Well, I'm not the chef in the family, but Dan cooks, makes amazing soups.
Okay.
He makes beans with tomatoes, very simple foods. It's like black-eyed peas or black beans with tomatoes and onions and all kinds of spices, a little bit of olive oil and some salt, maybe some sourdough bread.
Well,
to go
that's
on the
very
side.
complicated.
It's so easy, even I can do it. Trust me.
Is that it then?
Well, okay, here's a simple 2-ingredient meal.
Okay.
Sweet potatoes and coconut milk. Boil the sweet potatoes and mash it up with coconut milk. It's delicious. And it's got fat, it's got complex carbohydrates, it's got beta carotene. Two simple ingredients.
Okay, sweet potatoes and coconut.
Oh. You take black beans, brown rice, sweet potatoes, and you put some sriracha on top of it. So that's going to have all the amino acids necessary for human sustenance, beta carotene. It's cheap. Anybody can cook it. And by the way, it tastes delicious.
Probably tastes as good as cheese. Yeah.
Better.
Better.
Well, I want
Victor, you have.
Victor, go ahead.
Mr. Fan,
Okay.
you have something.
Yes, I think my sort of recipe is, which does include some lean, healthy proteins. That's seafoods and chicken, eggs, and so on. Because to have adequate protein taken by your body, you need much more plant-based proteins. It's not efficient to be absorbed by your body. I think I have been working with lots of nutritionists. Nutritionists do not encourage you to be a vegan. It's not efficient. I do agree we need to cut down meat consumption, absolutely, by half or by 2/3, but some small amount of meat, efficient and sustainably produced.
Well, if you're living in sub-Saharan Africa,
there's going to be some debate here.
Yeah, if you're living in a very, very poor part of Africa and it's hard to access foods, for sure, I 100% agree. But when we're in developed countries where food we have an excess of choices, then we don't have a problem with eating a big bowl of like vegetables and beans and grains and stuff like that. So, but I agree with you. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa, you eat whatever you can.
Let me give you an example.
There's no one size fits for all solution.
Just to follow up, look at Kathy Freston. Does she look malnourished? She hasn't eaten meat, eggs, cheese, or seafood.
She's glowing.
What? She's a perfect example of what you look like eat any animal product. She hasn't eaten an animal product in 13 years. Does she look
15?
15.
15 years.
There you go.
I probably cut down on my meat consumption to look that good.
I'll take it. Thank you. You're embarrassing me. Thank you, though.
Victor, you want to add something?
Well, I love tomatoes, so tomatoes and beans is my staples.
Yeah. All right, and thank you very much, my panelists. Very insightful and useful information for food, and I hope our audiences can also learn something today. Thank you for your wonderful talks and analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Wow.